Dear listeners of LifeStream FM, I am happy to announce that we have a next guest who is Ad Boon, the Chief People Officer, and he's here to share his wisdom and experience with us.
We're here together to discuss a very interesting topic, which is about the people in the companies and the leaders that are managing them, governing them, and taking them to the new future. But before that, I am heavily interested in the way you always talk about your children and the family and the role that they play in your life. I mean, the number 6 is quite interesting on its own, and I want to start with this one. Which one of your kids contributed more to you as a CPO, like in your DNA of formation?
You put me in trouble already, right? Because it's like, how do you select which child? But that said, so first of all, it's important to mention that I have 6 children, indeed. My most important person in life is my wife. They also, my kids know that, like she comes first. But together, like the 8 of us, it's like, that is my life. That's very important to know. I've become who I've become without regretting anything in my life. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you.
Exactly.
And I've learned a lot from my wife, and still do. And I learned a lot from all of my children, mostly by being a husband, becoming a father, and trying to be a good father, at least trying. And because I have 6, I think it's the same, like you have 2, I learned.
Yes.
I think it's the same, like we're both parents. The number doesn't really matter so much, I think. I just had more of an opportunity to go through the highs and the lows.
Right, now that I have a chance to give you a chance, because usually people, when they are interviewed, they have a question which they reflect on later on and they say, I could have answered better. Do you have such a question that bothers you all the time?
I don't know. I think I sometimes overshare about my personal life, which I think I'm always thinking, like, is that embarrassing for my family actually? But there's so many lessons into it for me, right? So to explain who I am and how I think and how I show up in life is so much influenced by how I am a husband and I'm a parent and a son of. I think it's just, so it's hard to explain some of the things that I'm thinking now without actually going into depth and sort of my personal life. And I think, look, that's also a level of vulnerability I think we lack sometimes in people. Like if I want to make sense of the world you live in, for me to be able to help you, either as a CPO within PAŠA or as a coach or as a friend, then I just need to understand where you came from. Like in many of the cases, I do this with everybody almost. We talk about your career and we talk about like what my advice for your career, and I sort of stop and I go back first, like tell me where you're from. Like who's your father? What did your father do? And what did your mother do? And what did you learn from?
Trying to understand the motives of the person.
Yeah, because it just gives me a sense of like where you came from. Because then I get a sense of like how resilient are you, what kind of values you have. It just helps.
That you said the number, I guess I remember the number 3. It said that if you can manage 3 children in your household, you can manage 1,000 people. Now, as a person who has doubled the amount, what can you say in your own experience dealing with the company?
I don't know. I mean, that logic with 3 to 1,000, I don't know. I've seen people that have no children manage beautifully, and I've seen people with 3 kids, and I have a different opinion about how they lead. So, but I think you learn from being a parent. So I think what you learn most likely is patience. In my case, I think you also learn about kindness.
Okay.
I think you learn about sharing. I think you learn about transparency and openness. But I think it's mostly being a human being, and that doesn't need to be switched off when you go to work. Maybe that's sometimes we tend to make that mistake sometimes.
Okay.
I see it sometimes in people.
This brings me to the question of, it's not just where you come from, but it's also, I think most of the people who watch this segment, they will be interested in your position. How do you reach that position? What should they do? Is there any roadmap for that? Any ingredients they need to have?
No, I think it's hard work. I think it's doing it for a long time, because I think a CPO should, and as a disclaimer, I'm not saying I am those things, but I think I really consider myself a student of what I do. I try to get better at it every single day. I read a lot, I watch podcasts, we talked about this. But I think to get here, you have to do it for some time. You have to, having gone through transformations quite a lot, I think you have to have different walks of life in terms of leadership, meeting different people, dealing with certain crises, personally and professionally. So I like experience. Like I just like that. Like having lived through some of the things that you are responsible for before you get here to this position. So I think it helps to have lived in certain countries first. I think it helps to have been part of several companies before. So like anybody else, I don't like job hopping, but I do like, so I think I've been part of 4 or 5 companies, which I like.
It's interesting. 2 days ago, I was explaining to my 13 and 11-year-olds about those 3-letter things, CEO, CTO, CFO, and trying to explain them in very simple terms. And now that I am here with CPO, how would you define that to those 13 and 11 years olds? How would they understand it as a role, as a job?
Yeah, I get that question sometimes from my kids when they were younger, right? And I still get them. Also from my parents, actually. Something like, well, what is it you do? And I've explained it like 17 times. I just deal with the people side of the business.
Okay.
So I just make sure we think about, what kind of capabilities and people that we need from a capability perspective, skills, knowledge, but also from a personality perspective, like what fits well and where do we find those people, which changes over time. I also think about if people are in organizations, like how do we design the ways of collaboration in organizations so people can feel safe, contribute, perform, and sometimes also to think about how we change organizations and to take people through transition while people or organizations go through transformation, which is actually different.
Okay.
So I take care of that side, right? So I sometimes feel I need to make sure that we're in business, we're building a house. I just need to turn it into a home where people feel okay.
I think you just want to get the multiple angles of this maybe context or the picture itself.
But I think it's the same as to go through a career. We often talk about what did you learn in this role, what did you learn in that role, and like how did you build up your career, like what country did you live in, which company were you part of. I think we learn a lot more from the transitions to the companies and from the transitions to the countries we lived in and through the transitions from married, not married, or all the way around, hopefully, being not being a parent, being a parent. Like what happened in the moments where you became, and I think that's where we often reflect not a lot on, and I think we must.
I think our conversation will also have a transition to the topic of endurance expedition, which is, I know from the Shackleton and his story. I need you to kind of go back to that story and try to explain it, or maybe explain the importance of the story through the perspective of leadership, the transformation that the team goes through, and the future that the leader tries to achieve. In that regard.
So that's interesting, and I really like the story. I mean, I'm not sure how much the story about Shackleton is known, but it's just such a cool story to relive in your life because it shows up in all of our daily lives and our careers. So first of all, he seemed to, I only know the stories being written about him, right? So I've never spoken to the man, and I wish I had the opportunity. But he seemed to know what he's good at, but also what he's not so good at. He had a belief, so he had a vision, and not so much about being right, but he thought that he could achieve something, and he's very much a realist. So he set out on this expedition where he thought, I'm going to be the first at this, but the moment he realized he couldn't achieve it, he said, my belief is now to be good in this. So he couldn't reach the end of the South Pole, cross the South Pole as a first. The moment he realized it, he said, my goal now is that I'm going to get everybody of my crew back alive, which is, it's a profoundly different belief. It's a profoundly different goal, but he set out to aim to achieve it. And he did, right? And so he was at the same time in competition with another explorer who said, that's my goal, that's my aim, I'm going to achieve it. Everybody died, right? So it's a very different way of being resilient, about goal setting, about being realistic, about the perception of truth. And so it's very different.
Talking about that, I remember there were times in 90s and 2000s when companies try to look at the thing that and say we are families to the people who work under them. And do you think they can manage this today nowadays, or it's just more like a venture? It's like more like a business, a mechanism.
First of all, we're not families. We're people who collaborate in the same organization for the same purpose. I think families is too close. I think, and this has been written about many times, but like you would never tell somebody to leave your family. Because it's like, and so it's hard. It's a hard connection. I don't see the connection between the two. I used to have the same terminology. But I also realized that it's not like that. It's a very different dynamic.
Then how do you create that magic or that bond if it's not on that level, like of trust, let's say, or loyalty, or is there any other way to find the alternatives and apply?
Well, I think it is about trust, right? So I think the fact that we're not family, which is a blood relationship, which is a lot of shared context starting from birth. Like we don't share that often, although we can work for a long time together, we just don't share that same context, or we don't have the same systemic parental relationship. But we do need to work in an organization where we can trust with each other, have trust in each other, right? And I think that's important. And trust is built with the very small things. For me, trust is a million small gestures and tokens, consistency between two people, or between a person and a leader and a person and an organization, versus like these big things like you know, I'm changing the organization. Trust me, doesn't mean anything. It's more like you remembered my name, you remembered when I said in that meeting and I did something which you liked, and you then tell me afterwards like, I liked that you did that, so I give you feedback. It's these very small things all together build that trust.
Why I asked this question about him and his expedition, I see him as one of the early CPOs actually. Like he cared about people, and it wasn't just the mission and the goal, it was the people of the and I remember what was the most captivating part of the story. After some years, when he offered them to do the same journey, like more than 80% of his crew, they agreed to go again to the same place, which is completely off the hook. And
it's actually interesting. I've never looked at it that way. So he certainly created an environment, but he also created a goal, a belief, and an organization. He needed people, so he put an advert into the newspaper where he said, I can't remember exactly the text, but he said things like,
it's going to be rough, hard.
It's going to be rough, it's going to be hard, it's a long expedition,
little pay,
probability of death, it's certain. Right, so it was like a job advert, job description, a very peculiar way of building his team. But he chose for skill, not so much for knowledge. He chose resilience above status, right? So he could be that's actually interesting. It could be a CPO type. I hope I have some of his traits.
Because I see the way he handled the transition of this. We have a functioning ship, and now we don't have a ship, and we don't know what's going to happen in the next 6 months. What are we planning to do with that? And he tries to not only show his worries, but also communicate all of that into his team. And he's actually giving some good delegation to them, and giving some good tournaments and championships and stuff like that, just to have the boost.
Well, he made, and again, people need to read the story because they're not going to understand our full conversation. But it's an invitation for everybody to read about the story. But he made work meaningful, right? Which is, there's a lot of the work that you and I do on a daily basis, which maybe not even for the organization at large leads ultimately to the goal. But for you and I, it's meaningful. And that's why I get up in the morning. But also, Simon Sinek talked about leaders eat last, right? What he did, like when really people had to leave the ship and start, walking across the South Pole to an uncertain horizon. He said, we need to drop everything. You don't take any belongings. He took out anything of value, gold, and dropped it into the snow, and he just walked off. Right? Just like he went first with everything.
I'm torn between two questions. I'm going to go with the first one, which is, there is, as you see in the company and the people, intergenerational dialogue, all those generations working together. Right. How do you deal with that? How do you translate that into your own work? And
I'm not sure if it plays a role in my mind. So I'm not sure that's right or wrong. I tend to try to not judge people. So I tend to not care what's the color of your skin, what's your age, who do you love. Tend to see people as human beings. So I don't care about your role or your level of hierarchy. For some projects or the way we need to work together, I do need to take all of that in consideration. But if you say intergenerational conversations, I don't tend to care.
I would take it to the next level, asking you, when you deal with the leaders and the CEO level people, I guess it's a certain generation people and a certain age group.
Right.
And, when it comes to the younger generation, like, do you feel the difference or the new approach or something very off or strange for you maybe?
So I'm 56. So I was born in 1969, so it's a long time ago. And I work with very interesting people across the course of my life, same as you. And now we're at this stage where I deal with, because of the type of work I do, I quite deal a lot with the people we call CEOs or C-level executives, usually at a bit of they're between 40 and 50 and something like that. Between 40 and 60, let's broaden it a little bit. It is very different than the younger generation. So I think I'm from the world where you worked hard and you showed up at work and on time and you stayed for quite a long time. And in the beginning, we didn't get laid off or didn't get fired. So there was this loyalty between a company and an employee. Where we are now in a stage where very meaningful and purpose-driven generation coming up, which I like. I like the fact that they like purpose and they
Okay.
like to know why they do what they do, but they don't reason from the fact of less loyalty, right? Because they've seen their fathers and their
Yeah.
mothers being laid off or having gone from organization A to B in quicker speeds than I used to do when like 10, 15 years. Like I worked for 20 years for the same organization, quite normal, not normal now. Their mindset and the way their role models have raised them and what they saw their parents do is very different to what I've experienced my parents do. So I understand why they think it's more, I stay with this organization until I find my work less meaningful. I don't think about I need to stay 4 to 5 years in a role when I'm younger because I need to learn. No, after 18 months I've learned enough and I don't feel my work being meaningful. I move to another position or move to another organization. I don't blame them for thinking like that. And sometimes they're right.
I see it again as like a textbook example of how you maintain yourself as a leader in uncertain environment and times. And besides that, as we talked about uncertainties of transformation and the different styles of leaderships, and what do you see in your own personal experience? What are the internal conversations of the leaders today, especially in this age and era of artificial intelligence, doing all this, I don't want to say damage, but disrupting everything that we believe that were very valuable at time. What's their internal conversation about managing this uncertainty maybe or going somewhere? Do they see that place?
I think many of the leaders, I'm just envisioning this, right? Their internal conversation, sort of their inner game. Most likely they know that they don't know and they have a willingness to follow the idea. I think they need to have a certain belief that that's okay because you can't know everything for certain. Certainly now, like this whole Gen AI thing, which is super real. Like we all need to get adjusted to it. We all need to read, study, and many of us, also your listeners, they don't. So we don't study enough, we don't know enough. We talk about it, we just don't know enough. Most likely those people who have a vision have spent time understanding those realities, which is something I admire them for. They're willing to go into the unknown. And usually they're inspiring about it for other people to follow them. Right? You can't lead if you don't have people following you. I think their inner game also must be fear. The real entrepreneur embraces that, I believe. They talk about that fear. They talk about what they don't know, but they say, well, this is at least my idea about this unknown. So this is what I'm going to try to create. I think it's also like many of the entrepreneurs or younger leaders are a bit younger. I think they're a bit more agile. I think what I've seen people do really well, particularly at the younger age, is know less, but they see patterns between all these different components. What's happening in the world, geopolitically, what's happening in technology, what's happening in how customers' behavior change, how customer journeys are therefore impacted. So, and they just connect the dots together.
I'm feeling that you're giving us some positivity in your vibes. So you think, for example, there will not be any dystopian scenarios where people will become commodities or liabilities. They will be still on the hierarchy in some way, or
I think so.
automation and robots are not going to do anything, like you say.
Yeah, I know this. I also look. I'm quite an open mind, right? So if people come to me with a doomsday scenario, it's not that I stop listening, right? I listen to it. I also like these complot thinkers. I listen to them, right? I just don't. It's just not my worldview. So I believe, what was the research? For every job AI is going to take, 1.2 jobs coming to existence. So ultimately, there's a surplus. We're growing as a population. I think we're now at around 8 billion people in the planet versus 7 billion when I was born. That's a big step in 50 years. I tend to believe that we're quite resilient as a species and that we find that we're quite creative. So we just have to find a way to work in the new reality that we create. It's a different question towards do I like what I see happening, right? I have a different view on that. And I'm most likely, my phone, like my family calls my phone the most boring phone alive because it doesn't have any social media on it, except for LinkedIn, which is I use professionally. I don't have an abundance of apps on it.
Okay.
But I like AI. I work with it. I use AI as a sparring partner, not to the full extent, but I like to spar with it. But I also like to create myself. So I like to be original in my thinking. I like to be original in my speak, in what I explain. But AI is how I can learn from it. I just do realize up until now, whatever answer AI is giving to me in terms of knowledge is an accumulation of everything we already know, that I know.
Right, well, I know from the chess community, it was a very positive example when they said engines will play chess better than anyone and everyone will stop doing that. On the contrary, a lot of people, especially after the pandemic, started playing it. It was like, okay, so let them engines have the tournaments for themselves, but we will still be emotional and take the risks. I guess companies will also take some certain directions from the overall emotions that we have, because we still want this uncertainty, even if it sounds crazy, but that's what makes us humans in the essence. Right. And then as we are trying to wrap up the entire conversation, is there anything that you notice in DNA of leadership? You have seen a lot. Is it same? Is it very different? Is it?
No, it changes. And it must, I think. It must change. So I think in the ever-evolving world of technology, I think we're looking more for community and belonging, and that needs to show up in leadership. You and I, we both need to master the skill of becoming a community builder for the people around us. Need to understand that by default people feel more lonely than they did 50 years ago. I also believe we need to work with the notion that knowledge and skills are more and more readily available, but that we need to see the patterns in those knowledge pieces that we have available to us. I think we need to be much more vulnerable in the way, and I think, look, we spoke about this for the last 10 years, about vulnerability, and that we need to step it up there. Let's just do it, and let's just not fight vulnerability, and let's not use culture as our excuse to say that we're not vulnerable as a culture. You know, that just doesn't.
It's a very tough call, but
yeah, it's a tough call, and I just don't think it's a good excuse anymore, because our newer generations are brought up with more vulnerability, and they want us to, for those who lead, to be more vulnerable.
Now,
which is about being honest as well.
We will discuss this later on with more details, but so I'm guessing now we have 40-plus-year-olds with a certain culture that they want to appropriate to the entire team, but those team members mostly are of the people who have new values, and they want to find the meaning and all the other things. And now you are in between those two groups, or are you orchestrating? I'm trying to understand, like, where do you see yourself in this process, and how do you deal with that mechanism or dynamics?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, actually. I try to give you an honest answer in the sense that I don't think I'm part of either one or two.
Exactly.
I just feel like I'm quite curious in my thinking. I tend to ask more questions than I give answers. Maybe my kids don't agree with me on that, but I tend to ask a lot of questions.
All right.
So I try to understand of the people that I work with and the people that I work for or try to serve. So I don't feel myself like I'm part of the older generation. I try to understand as much as I can the every generation.
So you don't see yourself as a referee?
I just don't think that way.
Okay, well, I'm guessing you don't see yourself as a referee or as a person who is like in between those two, which is very important.
No.
Good. I notice in most of your conversations and interviews, you always talk about giving back to community. We are going to give you this chance. The last question of the segment is usually something you advise as a part of personal development journey. So maybe some book, maybe some podcast, maybe some quote or a certain advice, let's say much younger professionals who want to do something big about this entire journey.
That's a very good question. Follow certain podcasts. People want to connect with me to see what do I read and what do I listen to and what do I view. Definitely will share. I think the best advice I can give to somebody, don't look for answers or inputs. Try to think of the questions you should ask yourself. I really love questions, and certain questions are very powerful. So the simple question, I'm just making this up, but who am I? If you just write it down on a blank piece of paper and then start thinking about it, that can lead to profound insights. Or how can I help is a very important question. Right? So don't look for answers, look for questions, and try to answer those questions first for yourself and try to grow because of it.
That's a very nice one, and thank you very much on that note to spending your time and sharing with us the wisdom and experience, and have a very nice day after this.
You too, enjoy.
Right.
All right, take care.
Thank you.